Welcome to Women's Sports Weekly, where women's sports happens every day, but we talk about it once a week. I'm Danielle.
And I'm Carolyn. Women's Sports Weekly is a podcast where we discuss the latest news, explore interesting stories, and share our love for women's sports. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Women's Sports Weekly Pod. Follow us and rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We are so excited for our interview with Frankie de la Cretaz. The interview with Frankie focuses on trans inclusion in sports.
This interview is unfortunately timely because the House recently passed legislation last Tuesday that would ban transgender athletes from participating in women's and girls' sports at schools and institutions receiving federal funds. It will now go to the Senate, so nothing is set in stone yet, but it is very alarming. To spend time creating a bill that targets such a small amount of people that have played sports without incident, and let's be really clear, this bill will not protect women and girls and will make both trans and cis women and girls' lives worse.
This bill is really unfortunate. Worst case scenario that this gets passed, it's going to create an environment where little kids are playing sports and someone on the team is going to be very good, and there are going to be other members of the other team calling out and saying, "That's a boy."
Well, it's already happening, and to your point, it's only going to get worse if this fully goes through, and I just am worried for the future of women's sports and girls' sports and people's lives and their well-being. It's just sad, honestly.
Frankie gets into this a little bit, and we talk about youth sports in the interview. The levels of suicidality among trans kids is so high compared to cis kids, and playing sports can be such an affirming space. And we're talking about sports and it can seem small, but this is such a bigger picture, and we could start here and it's going to be a really slippery slope, and I just hope that it doesn't pass in the Senate.
I agree. We talk about all the time how important sports have been to our lives, and to put that up at risk for others just makes me sick, honestly.
Before we begin with our interview today, I think it would be helpful to lay some groundwork. This next section, I'm affectionately calling the For My Mom section. So she can have all the definitions that she needs before we head into this interview. I also just want to point out that language changes all the time, and language always has changed. The language we use now may be different than the language used in the past, and it will definitely change in the future. So these are the terms we're using right now. Most likely will change into the future, and we adapt and we change with it like we always have. So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Gender identity. Gender identity is one's internal sense of self and their gender, whether that is man, woman, neither, or both. My own internal self of my gender is woman. I was assigned female at birth, and I do feel like a woman. And that makes me cisgender, which is our next term. Cisgender, or cis, which we use in the episode quite a bit, is an adjective that describes a person whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. Transgender, or simply trans, is an adjective used to describe someone whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. A transgender man, for example, or trans masc is what we used quite a bit in this episode, is someone who was listed as female at birth, but whose gender identity is male. A trans woman is someone who was listed male at birth, but whose gender identity is female. Non-binary is a term that can be used by people who do not describe themselves or their genders as fitting into categories of man or woman. So these are all terms that we use throughout the episode. Hope that it's helpful for you to just lay the groundwork of what we're working with today. We are delineating today in the podcast because of the topic that we're talking about, which is trans inclusion in sports. But in a normal day-to-day, when I say the word woman, I'm using the word woman to describe both cis women and trans women, all encompassing. And when I use the word man, I'm describing both trans men and cis men. A lot of negative comments that I see about trans athletes, especially in women's sports, is the quote, "They are biological men." And to that, I cannot recommend the podcast Tested enough. It is hosted by Rose Eveleth and really examines what is a woman. Is it their chromosomal makeup? Is it their testosterone levels? Is it the genitals they have? Because what some people think of as such a clear binary really is not. And this podcast does such a great job of going into it. The focus of the podcast is not trans athletes, but actually cis women who are no longer able to race professionally due to their biology. Frankie, throughout the episode, also provides a lot of great recommendations throughout our interview.
Although there are people who would like to see trans and non-binary people disappear, that is simply not how it works. Trans and non-binary people have always been here and will always continue to be here, whether there are laws and rules and regulations that support them or not. So even if you don't think trans athletes should be able to compete, I really hope you listen to this episode. Let's get informed, dispel some myths, and find ways we can be supportive of all people.
Frankie de la Cretaz is a freelance writer who commonly covers stories at the intersection of sports, gender, culture, and queerness. They are the co-author of the book Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League, and their work is featured in the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and Runner's World magazine, just to name a few. A listener suggested we begin following and reading Frankie's articles, and we are so happy we did. Their Out of the League Substack newsletter has become a staple of my week, and Frankie is here today to talk to us about trans participation and inclusion in women's sports. We are so happy to have them. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We like to start every interview getting to know a little bit more about the person. So can you tell us about yourself, how you got into writing, and why so much of your writing focuses on sports?
Yeah, so I live in Boston, and I am not originally a writer. That's not what I went to school for. This is actually my second career. I actually started as a social worker, and I got pushed out of my job on maternity leave after I'd had my first child. And I always wanted to be a writer, and I always had a blog. Remember when those were a thing? So I had a blog, and I had a bit of a following, and that was just like something that I did for fun. And I had a friend get in contact with me who was like, I feel like you could write. Is this something that you would ever want to do professionally? And I thought she was joking, because I was like, who would ever pay me to write anything? Anyway, she wasn't joking. She connected me with an editor at Cosmo, and I started writing essays, personal essays, because that's all I knew how to do. Eventually, I started to want to do more, mostly because I was running out of things to write about. There's only so many essays about your trauma that you can write, but also the money wasn't as good, and so I pivoted into journalism. I'm self-taught. I kind of elbowed my way in. Originally, I was a generalist. I wasn't writing about sports, and for me, that shifted because I'm a huge sports fan. I grew up watching sports with my dad. I think a lot of kids, and particularly kids who are raised girls, can relate to having the dad that you have nothing to connect about, so you watch sports with him, and that's like the thing that you guys do together. I also had that dad, but I didn't see any sports writing like I thought I would do anywhere. And what's funny is, if you know me now, you will know that I would be like, oh my god, a gap in the market. Clearly, you should slide right in there. At the time, though, I was like, I don't think anyone would hire me to do this. Like, I don't think there's a place for my voice. I remember my then husband was like, are you saying you can't write about sports because you're not a guy? And I was like, oh my god, is that what I'm saying? And that was enough for me to just decide that I was going to write about sports, and I really have elbowed my way into an industry that I think really doesn't always know what to do with me. And so I think I just write the kind of content that I want to read, and I write the kind of content that I think people that I'm in community with want to read. I also describe myself as someone who writes about sports for people who think they don't care about sports, and I hear that from people a lot. I don't watch sports, but I read your work, and that's like the biggest compliment to me, because yeah, anyone who cares about sports knows that it's like a human experience, and so there's so much more that's of interest there. It means a lot to me that people find that through my work.
So today we're going to focus on trans inclusion in sports in our conversation, and there's this rhetoric that's happening right now that trans people and non-binary people are taking over women's sports, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, when in fact trans and non-binary people make up a very small percentage of the U.S. population. According to Pew Research in 2022, it was estimated that it was around 1.6% of the U.S. population is trans or non-binary. So why do you believe this rhetoric is happening and increasingly getting louder?
That's a really big question.
It is.
Because this rhetoric isn't actually about sports. And so I actually want to zoom out and look at the political climate in the US right now. And I want to actually go back to 2016-ish when we first saw what we know now as the bathroom bills starting to be passed. Those are bills that banned people from using bathrooms and locker rooms that didn't align with their assigned sex at birth. Now, if you remember, there was one that passed in North Carolina, and the reaction to that was the NCAA pulled out their tournaments. A bunch of people said they weren't going to come, and that was reversed. That was a no-go, and those bills failed. Now, the right-wing Christian lobbying groups, and particularly one or two groups, have really been trying to pass anti-trans legislation, and they started with those bathroom bills, and those were a failure. And so what happened is they created, I'll use the word playbook, and that playbook started with sports because sports was the one place that you could make trans people seem like a threat to even like well-meaning people, right? You can use things about fairness and safety, and you can really use this concern for cis girls' bodies and well-being to fearmonger and be like, well, this isn't actually about prejudice, it's about fairness. Now, that worked, right? We saw over 25 states now have these bills that ban trans kids from playing sports. And if you watch almost every single state that passed a bill banning trans kids from playing sports has eventually passed bills to ban gender-affirming care and maybe potentially also add these locker room bills. When you make a group of people a threat in one area, it makes it a lot easier to make them a threat in other areas and to expand that threat. And sports was the place that they started, and that was intentional because they hadn't had success in other areas. And so that is actually why all of this has happened, and you can see that really, really clearly. And in fact, I think it was Mother Jones, I want to say, did a really big piece a couple years ago actually showing this playbook and how it was laid out by groups like the ADF. Is that the Alliance Defending Family?
Let me look it up. Alliance Defending Freedom.
Alliance Defending Freedom.
Got it. And it's so interesting because this playbook, it's like so easy to watch, right? And then we see people who I think are well-meaning, right? And then all of a sudden they're saying these same things about fairness. Well, it's not fair. I've heard you say before, fair to whom? So can you talk a little bit about this fairness idea of trans participation within women's sports and who is it fair for?
Yeah, sports just like isn't fair. I think this is like a funny thing because when we talk about advantage looks like access to equipment, access to coaching. Advantage looks like parents who will drive you to practice. There's so many ways that advantage looks. Biological advantage also looks like LeBron James obviously has a biological advantage toward being good at basketball. Me and LeBron James do not have an equal chance at being NBA players. We don't. Any elite athlete has some sort of biological advantage that allows them to be good at their sport. And people get really upset when you talk about that, when you're like, actually, elite athletes are kind of like freaks. Like, they're freaks of nature. And people don't like to hear that because, you know, who else is freaks? It's trans people. But, you know, we can put that aside. But when we talk about fairness, I think this is where the anti-trans faction has been really, really good at centering the conversation in the wrong place because it's a red herring. And when we talk about fairness in any capacity, we should always be centering the most marginalized people in the room. In this case, that would be trans women and girls. And instead, what we're doing is we're centering the feelings of cisgender people and cisgender girls rather than the reality of the people who are being excluded and discriminated against. And so we're asking the wrong question. We're asking, is this fair to these cis girls rather than saying, is it fair to exclude people based on their identity? And the fact is, the United Nations and Human Rights Watch have deemed all of this a human rights violation. Even the Olympic Charter says that the right to access sports free from discrimination it's a human right. So we have all of these things out here saying, no, this is wrong. And instead, we're like, oh, I think that it's unfair that I didn't win a medal. I'm like, okay, it's unfair that you didn't win a medal. And meanwhile, this person is being accused of being like a sexual predator in the locker room. These things like aren't weighted equally. And I think what's happened is we've taken what is actually a conversation about basic human rights and turned it into something about who has a right to stand on a podium.
And you brought up the LeBron James piece. We have that conversation all the time. When you have a male athlete who is above all else or has more testosterone or whatever it is, they're deemed as this magical person. And if it's a woman, they're getting tested or there must be something wrong with them. And then to your point, it creates this whole conversation about trans athletes and how they're damaging women's sport. It's just unfortunate, and we get so frustrated with that piece and have conversations about it all the time. And you're right. At the end of the day, who are we protecting? We're just creating more harm for these people who just need someone to look at them and say, you're welcome here.
I think the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when we police the womanhood of trans women, that actually puts all women and girls in danger, because anyone who is not feminine enough, anyone who does not conform to this white Western ideal of femininity, then becomes in danger of having their own gender police and their own gender questioned. And I think that too many people do not realize this, and it has started to happen. We see girls who have short haircuts or more masculine builds being accused of being trans or suspected of being trans. I don't like the word accused because it sounds like something would be wrong if they were. So I would say suspected of being trans. You see that starting to happen. And that is the logical end result of policing people's gender. I think the sooner that cis women and girls realize that their safety and liberation is actually tied up with trans women and girls rather than working in opposition to each other, the sooner that we will create the kind of solidarity that is needed to stop what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, especially with these ideas of testosterone level testing, and we've seen it in the professional running world. So can you talk a little bit about that? What testing could look like, what it has looked like, what would be like maybe an inclusive way? Do we throw testing out? What is your idea of that?
So testing has looked a variety of ways. You can actually trace the roots of sex testing back to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Shout out Nazi Germany. So these are literally the roots of sex testing in sports. If you're interested in more about that, there's a book called The Other Olympians by Michael Waters. It is completely about how that happened. It's fantastic, and I really recommend it. And over the years, we have seen different kinds of sex testing, particularly and usually at the elite and like Olympic level. That has included chromosome tests, that has included genital exams. Those always disproportionately impacted Black and brown women and women who are not from Western countries. We don't do those anymore, for a variety of reasons, but honestly, the main reason that we don't do those anymore is that cis women kept finding out that their chromosomes weren't what they thought they were. Because people are intersex, sex is not a binary, and cis women kept finding out that they were intersex, and people did not like that, and so this stopped. What testing tends to look like now is based on testosterone levels, and I'm talking at the elite level, and most people agree. I'd say most like reasonable people, not the most fervent anti-trans people, but even certain people who think there should be restrictions and testing in place at the elite level, a lot of them believe that that should not apply at the scholastic level. But we are seeing some of those regulations trickle down to youth sports and collegiate sports as well. So there's this like flattening happening, which didn't used to be there. And I think that that's a problem too, because we shouldn't be holding a 6th grade trans girl who wants to play soccer to the same standards that we're holding an elite athlete, regardless of whether I think testosterone testing is right or wrong. I can say that we shouldn't be holding kids to the same standards that we're holding elite athletes, and you're starting to see some of that flattening happen. But at the elite level, currently in the international federations who haven't outright banned trans women from participating at this point, they are based on testosterone levels, and it requires people who compete in the women's division to have testosterone levels under a certain amount. And even the Olympics, the International Olympics Committee has come out and said that that shouldn't be a thing anymore, that there is no science that supports these levels, and that sports vary. Like, every sport needs different requirements. The thing that the International Olympic Committee has not done well, which is where the problem remains, is they've said this shouldn't happen anymore, but they've punted responsibility for what should happen to the international federations and haven't put any teeth in place. So they've basically said, you shouldn't do this, but each sport gets to decide, and we won't punish you or anything if you disregard our suggestions. So that's where the bans have come into place. I think I am probably on the extreme end, where I say I don't really think that we should be testing anyone's testosterone levels. I don't think we're ready to blow up how we think about sports altogether in terms of how it's organized. If we were to navigate the existing system where we have men's and women's sports, for me, I would say that people should get to self-determine which division they are competing in. If a problem hasn't presented itself, why are we creating one? There has never been an issue here with a trans person or a trans woman unfairly winning anything, and there has never been a man who has transitioned just to win at women's sports, which is my favorite argument, actually. I think for me, I'm like, we're creating a problem where there isn't one, and until there is a problem, I don't see a need to actually be putting these systems in place. For me, I feel like we should let people compete where they want to compete, and if there ends up being an issue, we can address it then, but there hasn't been one. So that's, and I know I'm on the extreme end of that, and I think that there's kind of people who fall everywhere along the spectrum. I know that there's a lot of people who think there should be some sort of standards in place for elite level athletes, and maybe everyone else can self-determine. But yeah, that's where I fall.
Yeah, I think about a lot because I try to challenge my own thinking every once in a while. And it's like, what would I need to see in order to change my mind, right? Like, I think that trans people should be able to play in the division that they identify with. And I'm like, for me, I would need to see exactly what you just said. Men coming out to their families, telling everyone that they're going to transition so that they can go and win at the women's elite level. And it's just not going to happen.
No.
And my whole thing is, I don't think people actually believe that. At least the people pushing that agenda, do they actually believe that? I think they're just creating this fear for other people to be like, oh, that could happen.
Yeah.
I think there are people out there that do believe that, but the people who are pushing that, I don't think actually believe that. In their heads, they're like, what story can I create that is going to create this fear for other people that they start believing this? And
that's agreeing.
A good one. I mean, that's my whole view on that piece, because I just think they're saying things to get people on board to make a change. And unfortunately, this change negatively impacts others, and they don't care about that.
So fun. Okay, let's get into youth sports just a little bit, because youth sports for the both of us was incredibly instrumental to both our lives. And when you were talking about your dad and a way to connect, I was like, I think we both did that to a degree. But it taught us values like teamwork and leadership skills and community. And many trans kids have been playing in youth sports without incident. And you have a really good piece in Self Magazine. I just want to call it out. And it's called What It Looks Like When Trans Kids Are Simply Allowed to Play Sports. So can you talk about some of the negative repercussions that trans youth face if they are unable to play sports that match their gender identity? And then can you talk a little bit about what you talked about in the article? When they are allowed, what does that look like?
When we deny trans kids the ability to play sports, we deny them the opportunities that every kid gets, like you just mentioned, right? Teamwork, camaraderie, sports build confidence. There's all of these things that kids get from playing sports, and to deny kids that opportunity if they want them is to deny them that fundamental, also like access to American culture, right? If we think about what a big part of American culture sports are, and we're completely excluding them from this based on their identity, or asking them to misgender themselves in order to access it, which is an act of violence, honestly. No one should have to hide who they are or repress who they are in order to access sport, and that is what we are asking kids to do when we deny them access to sports. Particularly for trans kids, it can be such an affirming space because it can allow them to bond with their peers of their lived gender identity. It helps socialize them into the norms of that group if that's a thing that is important for them to understand. It makes them feel accepted. Trans kids have such high rates of suicidality, and having peers who accept them and helping them be part of a team and building their self-confidence are huge factors in lowering rates of suicidality. We know that when we affirm trans kids' gender, their rates of suicidality like plummet. That is the number one thing that you can do to help trans kids' mental health. The other thing that I think that we don't talk about a lot is how many trans kids that don't know they're trans are playing sports, because how many trans people come out as kids? Actually not that many. And we're seeing more because there's more awareness of it, but most of the trans adults that I know, we were trans kids without knowing that we were trans kids. And like, what kinds of messages are they absorbing around sport? Is that a thing that is keeping people from being able to even think about whether or not they might be trans? You hear that from elite athletes all the time that were like, I knew that if I was trans, this profession of mine or that college scholarship, because I was good, right? Like, if I even looked at this, if I even questioned this, that would go out the window. And so I think like we often talk about the kids who know they're trans and are out, but there's also all these kids who are trans and maybe don't know it yet or don't have the ability to access that yet, who are learning from the culture around them too and are being sent a message about whether or not it's actually okay to even begin to explore their self and like their own identity.
This actually makes me think of the article you wrote in Runner's World on Nikki Hiltz. For those listening, Nikki Hiltz is an Olympic professional runner, and one of the things in the interview that you all discussed was in 2016 when Nikki Hiltz had surgery, they had some time to think through feelings that they were suppressing over time, and they started coming out slowly to family and friends. After that, they just open up and feel more confident and become a professional runner. And prior to that, they thought their running career was basically at a standstill. And to me, that's not accidental, right? They were able to start coming out and feel comfortable with themselves. And then as a result, their running kind of took off. That just reminds me of what you're saying about you have these kids who don't necessarily know it. And if they're able to express that earlier on, how much can that change their lives and benefit their lives down the line?
So some sports governing bodies are moving the goalposts to be eligible to play in women's sports, which results in athletes struggling to know if they will be eligible to play. And some are just flat out saying that if you were born female at birth, you must play in women's. If you were born male at birth, then you must play in men's, for how they're describing assigned at birth. So what leagues should we have our eyes on that are less inclusive? The LPGA has come to mind recently. And if any, what league should we look at as a model?
Yeah, so the LPGA just became the first U.S. professional women's league to ban trans women from playing and competing in the women's division. I'm interested to see what happens here. I think if we look at disc golf, which not a lot of people are familiar with, it's basically like golf but with frisbees. So the Disc Golf Pro Tour attempted this a couple years ago. There was one trans woman who won a tournament, and that was the end of that for her. The way they do this is they don't say that no trans women can compete. This is kind of what all of these, when we talk about a ban, what's actually happening is the language says that no nobody who transitioned, nobody who went through a testosterone driven puberty can compete in the women's division. So, in order to qualify for the women's division, if you're trans, you would have had to transition before puberty. We can also be like, oh, wow, and now states are banning gender affirming care for minors, so we're creating an impossibility. So, it is essentially a ban, right? But the Disc Golf Pro Tour attempted to ban Natalie Ryan, and she sued in a bunch of states, and she won in like 2 states. So she started suing in all the states that the tournaments were in. The Pro Tour responded by moving the locations of some of the tours. It was ugly, but Natalie won 2 of those lawsuits, and the Disc Golf Pro Tour was like, we can't financially actually do this, and so they changed their policy. Now, that is the only example on the pro league level that we have here, so I'm interested to see if Haley Davidson, who is the golfer that inspired the LPGA to put this in place, follows a similar tactic or not. The rest of the women's pro leagues either have policies in place that allow for trans and non-binary people to compete. The NWSL comes to mind for that, or doesn't have a policy in place. That's the WNBA and the PWHL are the 2 major ones that I'm thinking of here. I don't necessarily think that not having a policy is a bad thing. I know a lot of people want a policy, but once you put a policy in place, then you can start excluding people. Without a policy, there is nobody to exclude. So I think, particularly in a league like the WNBA, where we know there have been trans, non-binary identified players, transmasculine, not trans women that we know of, and that is also made up of predominantly Black women and Black athletes. You really don't want to put a testosterone testing policy in place there, because I think you would actually wipe out large segments of that league. And I think it's a good example as to how these policies are flawed. I will say that when we start talking about these leagues, and this is where we haven't really talked about transmasculine or non-binary athletes who are assigned female at birth yet, because they are not the main people who are being targeted by these bills. But when we talk about women's pro leagues, these are actually the athletes that we've seen so far have come out or have played. Depending on the league, they either allow transmasculine or non-binary players who aren't on testosterone to play, or some leagues, and I think the NWSL allows for a low dose of testosterone for medical transition reasons. So on the pro level, that's kind of what we're looking at. We have a couple leagues without policies. We have the NWSL that has a fairly inclusive policy that hasn't really come up against anything yet. And then you've got like the LPGA who's out here banning people. From the elite level, which is like the Olympic level, you've seen a whole bunch of bans come across this year and the last 2 years. That includes cycling, that includes swimming, that includes chess. Track and field is the big one. Is always the track and field has the distinction of being the creator of sex testing and just continues to be the leader in discriminatory policies. And so those are the big ones. But yeah, keep your eye out, because there's probably a few more than that as well.
When I think about trans participation in sport, it's like, okay, so we, especially at the elite level, and that's what I'm talking about, we want people to be freakish. We want them to be so good at their sport. And then a trans person is so good at their sport, and then for some reason it's unfair. And that is where I struggle, because they should be very good. If you're a professional, you should be freakishly good. It's not because you're trans. It's because of all of the work that you've put in and the hours, and especially in the chess, it's like, just tell me more that you think men are smarter than women, or tell me more that you think are just men are inherently better than women in everything. And I don't think that's true either.
No, it's a good point, because trans people have been participating, like trans women have been allowed to compete in the Olympics since 2003, and there never was one until the 2020 games. Trans people and trans women can compete in sport until they win, and now they can't compete anymore. And I think people also don't fully know. I look at the history of sex segregation in sports and why sports are organized the way that they are now, and actually sports were not sex segregated until women beat men. So you can look like figure skating is a good first example of this. It was like 1903, somewhere around there, the first time a woman competed in the pro skating, and she got a silver medal, and the women's category was created the next year. Another example of this, and this is my favorite because I think it's a great example of a sport that shouldn't and doesn't need to be sex segregated, is all of the rifling and shooting sports in the Olympics. Those were not sex segregated. Those were integrated. Those were co-ed until 1992, and a woman set the Olympic record and won gold, and the next year women were banned and it became a men's division. And the awful thing about that is that they didn't create a women's division until, I want to say, somewhere around like the 2000 games. And so that athlete, that woman who set the Olympic record at the Barcelona Games, was forced to prematurely retire from her sport because there was actually no way for her to continue competing. But we can look at that, right, and see men didn't like to lose to women. And we see the same thing happening here, where trans women are allowed to compete until they win, and once they win, it's unfair.
So there is this idea floating around, and it was most recently highlighted by former WNBA player Angel McCoughtry, that trans people should have their own league. So can you talk about your feelings on that? Is that an inclusive next step? What are your thoughts?
I'm personally against this. I think this looks a few different ways. First of all, I will say there are some sports, some marathons and like triathlons come to mind for this, that are having non-binary divisions.
Yeah, we've seen it here in Colorado.
Yeah. And like that's great, and that is a great thing for people who want to be inclusive. But like we've been talking about Nikki Hiltz, and we can just look at them where they're still competing at the elite level in the women's division because they're the only person in the non-binary elite category. And this highlights actually the problem, I think, with trans-only leagues, is that there's so few, as we've been talking about. The NCAA, Charlie Baker, the head of the NCAA, was recently asked in like a Senate hearing how many athletes in NCAA are trans, and it was less than 10 of, what is it, like 100,000, whatever it is. There's all these athletes. Less than 10 of them are trans. And so you can already see what the problem is. We've also talked about that these trans people, trans athletes, are very, very good, not because they're trans, but because they're elite athletes. They have trained to be good at a sport, and then there is a lack of meaningful competition at the elite level. So if we're talking about the elite level, not only is there a lack of meaningful competition for trans people, you probably don't really have enough athletes to even put these leagues together, and you also are othering them. You're othering them. It's like a trans-only league is a form of othering, and I think a lot of people do not realize that the leagues that we know of as men's leagues are not actually men's leagues. There's actually no gender category. We jokingly call it the MNBA, but the name is just, it's the National Basketball Association. A woman has been drafted into it. Women are able to be drafted into Major League Baseball, into the NHL, and one has been in the past. So when we actually look at why the women's leagues exist at all, it's because there was a lack of opportunity. This is where women's leagues, if we look at why they exist, it's because there was a lack of opportunity for women to be drafted into these other pro leagues, and therefore I think of that being them marginalized by their gender. And I think that the women's leagues really should be these leagues that are for athletes who are marginalized by gender, and I think that is probably the best solution, rather than actually siloing trans people into their own leagues. At the like club level and things like that, there's very cool trans leagues happening. I profiled a league called the Basket Dolls, and they're in Brooklyn. They're an all-trans pickup basketball league. They have a trans mask like brother league called Trand One. There's the Tranquil Breakers happening in LA. There was recently all trans mask wrestling happening in LA and is coming to New York City, right? You can find these leagues if you are a trans person who is not an elite athlete who wants to play sports and like find community. Those are popping up, and that is really what those are for. They're community spaces rather than elite meaningful competition.
Yeah. So how do we cut through it, right? Like it seems like it's so fear-based, and maybe this is a question we need to be asking ourselves, but like how do we cut through the fear? And I think you spoke a little bit about like where's the injustice actually happening, and I think that's part of it, but what are your recommendations to how to cut through the fear, and like how to talk to well-meaning people who are hearing all of this?
I think there's two realities here right now. I think the systemic and cultural reality is that things are probably going to get worse before they get better. I like don't feel super optimistic about any of that. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm proven wrong. But I feel like we're entering just a really dark time for trans rights generally. I do think, especially when we look at the in context for how many other things are at stake for trans people in this country, whether it's our healthcare, whether it's our right to like actually exist or access public spaces. I think it's easy to be like, sports aren't a big deal, or sports should be the last concern. But again, as I've already said, sports is the gateway prejudice and the like gateway place for discrimination, but also anti-trans sports bills lead to a lot of this other discriminatory legislation. What you do when you say that trans people don't have the right to compete in sport, and then you say they can't use the locker rooms and they can't use the bathrooms, what you're actually doing is trying to legislate them out of public life. And so I think it's important to say that it isn't just sports that we're talking about, right? These are people's lives and livelihoods and just the right to exist in public and in society. And so I'm pretty negative on that big picture thing, but I think if we talk about on the interpersonal level, on the person-to-person level, on the maybe you actually are an ally but you've read too much of the New York Times level, I think I have found that most people don't actually know anything about this. I had a conversation recently with a family friend of my partner, and she found out about my work, and she's like a well-meaning, has queer kids. Her queer kid has a trans feminine partner, you know, very much considers herself an ally, and had some real questions and was like, but isn't this unfair? But isn't it true that? And just sitting there and being like, no, that's not actually true. Or, you know, trans women are much more likely to be assaulted in a locker room than they are to be perpetrators of violence. Or studies are actually showing that trans women have disadvantages after going through HRT and medical transition. And people don't understand that. People don't understand that what's happened is they've taken studies done on cis men and then assumed that trans women's bodies are going to work the same. And they don't. It's actually a disadvantage now because you have larger lungs and heart because you have a larger body, but then the way that you pump blood through your body changes, and actually they have a disadvantage when it comes to actually being able to fill their lungs. And so that's things like lung capacity with sprinting and swimming, right? This is just like one place. They're much more likely to have degenerative bone stuff happening. Another thing people don't know, I'm like, do you know that testosterone level that we're asking trans women to have is lower than most cis women's natural testosterone levels? Do you know that actually some trans women are making themselves sick to keep their testosterone levels low enough to compete at their sport, right? I'm like, all of this are just things that people don't know. And so some of that is helpful. But I also will say, and this is a thing I say a lot, is when we get really caught up on the bodies of trans athletes and the bodies of what genitals do you have, what chromosomes do you have, what are your hormone levels, we are dehumanizing people. What we're actually talking about here is people. And this is something that I think a lot of mainstream journalism, this is where I think a lot of harm is done, because when we overly focus on the bodies, people have this weird, gross, pornographic curiosity about the bodies of trans people to begin with. It creates this like freak show out of us. But also when you overly focus on those things, you can reduce somebody to their genitalia or to their chromosomes or to their hormone levels. You actually take away their humanity and you lose that there's a person that we're actually talking about. And so like the main thing that we can really do is come back to the fact that we're talking about people. We're not talking about hormone levels, we're talking about people. And there is a person whose life is being destroyed, or there's a person who's being dehumanized, or there's a person who's being denied their basic human rights. And that is actually what we should be concerned about.
Those are all just such great points. So thank you for pointing those out. I want to get into this idea that people may or may not know a trans or non-binary person because the population is so small. They may think they don't know. They may actually know someone. You do such an amazing job of telling the stories, of like really personalizing these people beyond their bodies. So is there a favorite moment you have from one of your interviews? Is there something that you just like love to do when you're highlighting these stories? Like what is most important to you?
I think for me, what's most important, and almost all of my work, if you read it, I don't really talk about people's bodies or their transition. I don't over explain their gender. And if I do, there's a reason I do it. And I'm going to tell you in the text why I'm doing it. I wrote a Sports Illustrated feature a few years ago on non-binary athletes, and I led with Lasia Clarendon, who at the time was a WNBA player, and I got their first interview post top surgery. So they had top surgery during the off season one year. I broke a bunch of those rules. I talked about their body and their top surgery, but in the text I said it is considered bad form to do this. This is why I'm doing it. So I'm breaking the fourth wall too, to let cis readers know this line of questioning is not actually an okay thing for you generally to approach trans people with, right? So that is something that I try really hard. I also tend to reflect people's own words that they use for themselves, and I try not to over-explain. Obviously, it has to be legible to a mainstream audience who may not have the language, but if I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna lead with the way people talk about themselves. I think you mentioned my profile of Nikki Hills, and I think it was really profound for me to be sitting with them and actually have them say out loud, I would be on testosterone if I wasn't a professional runner. It was heartbreaking. And I think that that was significant. I did that interview many, many months before, because it was a magazine cover story, and so that takes a long time to come to print. And after we did that interview, even just saying it to me gave them the confidence. They started making TikToks about it. So like they had talked about it publicly before my story came out. And I think that's the other thing I will say is trans people will say things to me that they won't say to cis journalists, because I have sources who are people who are, maybe they're advocates, maybe they're constantly talking to media, that's part of their job, right? And when I talk to them, they say to me, I'm going to say this to you differently because I trust that you're not going to twist it, or you're not going to take it out of context, or you're not going to misunderstand what I mean. I interviewed somebody for a story that hasn't run. I hope maybe it will find a home one day, but there's someone whose story was covered like quite a bit, and I got in contact with them and I asked them a bunch of questions, and they were like, you are the first person that has asked me most of these questions. And this person had been covered in the Washington Post, and you know, they've gotten mainstream press, and I'm sitting there going, wait a second, back up, tell me, like, I'm gonna get in the weeds with you for a minute and I have some questions. And they were like, no one has ever asked me any of those before. And it's the difference, I think, between someone who's not just in community but like on this beat, and that I understand there's certain things that I'm gonna need to ask that a lot of cis journalists or people who are parachuting into this issue just don't even know that they don't know. But I will say my favorite question to ask, and the question that I ask any queer or trans person that I interview, is what their zodiac sign is and if they know their chart. And if they don't, I've actually run a few people's charts during interviews.
That's awesome.
I love that. What's your sign?
I'm a Sagittarius sun with a Virgo moon and a Cancer rising.
Oh, so I am the third child. My mom doesn't know what time I was born, and it's not on my birth certificate.
Okay,
so I have
that's
no
so
idea.
My brother, mine is not on my birth certificate either. My mom just like happened to have it in like a baby book thing, but my brother he's requested his birth certificate from the state. It's Florida. We apparently don't have birth times on our birth certificate.
Wow.
Do you have a sense of what your brother is, or?
We know his whole chart except for his rising sign. So
Okay.
he suspects, he thinks he knows what his rising sign is. I'm not 100% sure I agree. My mother doesn't have baby books or anything, though. She has a trash bag in the garage full of like photos. So maybe there's one of him as an infant with a birth time on the back that we'll find one day.
Danielle is triple Leo.
Oh my goodness. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. You might not get that off of this interview.
No, it's fun. I think actually my favorite time that I did it was Sue Bird is a Libra, and she has a couple other Libra placements, and she's a point guard. The Libra is the ultimate point guard because the Libra is the person, you're the mediator. Like, you're the person that has to kind of balance and hear every single side of and understand what is going on. And I explained how Libra and point guard made a lot of sense, and I thought that was really fun. Nikki Hills was also really fun to do, actually, because they are in Arizona, and I was there the night of the full moon. It was Sagittarius season, so this is why I know this. It was a full moon in Gemini, and I interviewed them the next day. And I'd never seen a full moon in the desert. It was nuts. It was beautiful. And hilariously, everyone I talked to the next day, just like getting coffee, like whatever, was talking about the moon. I guess it's like a thing. You can really see it out in the desert. The first thing Nikki said to me was like, did you charge any water for the full moon? They have a bunch of Gemini placements. And a lot of that gets cut. You know, you write this thing. And I had written quite a bit about the idea of Gemini. Gemini is like the twins, and sometimes there's an element of duality. They're sometimes known as being like two-faced, which is, I think, you know, not a great stereotype, but I think you can straddle different lines and move through different worlds. And I use the idea of this Gemini duality and the way that they have had to hide who they are and like to be an athlete, and how you like merge those things. And that was fun because I showed up and they were like, hey, it was a full moon in Gemini, and I'm a Gemini moon and a Gemini rising. And I was like, all right, let's talk about this.
That's awesome.
That's so cool. And such a great way to connect with people and get to learn more about a person, whether they connect with their sign or not. I'm a Taurus. That's as much as I know. But my whole family's Geminis, and people are always like, oh, I feel so bad for you. But I'm like, they're pretty even. So
yeah, I think it's fun, and it's a different way in. A lot of times I'm interviewing people who have been profiled a bunch, and it's like something different. It's kind of become a signature of mine, I think, at this point. Also, I always try to, if I can find out people's Mars signs, I do, because Mars rules sports. And so one of my favorites here is Caitlin Clark is an Aries Mars, and an Aries Mars is hyper competitive and really explosive, and they wear that on their sleeve. And every time I read a thing about how Caitlin is competitive and Caitlin is annoyed with people who do the wrong thing, and I'm like, yeah, you keep telling me she's an Aries Mars, I know.
You're just confirming what I already know.
I know.
That's awesome. As we wrap up today, we want to know who your favorite athlete is in women's sports, either currently playing or previously played.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I guess, honestly, I will say I have a soft spot for Laysia Clarendon, because I started covering the WNBA, and I was covering the Connecticut Sun because that is my local team, and Laysia was in Connecticut at the time. And so they were always on my radar, and I really admire their activism and the way he has really changed a lot of the WNBA in terms of the profile around their activism. So I really respect that, but also I will say, just like as a trans journalist, Laysia has really been giving me a lot of grace and made time for interviews and been really responsive in a way that like I see you kind of thing. And I also think an entirely underrated player, and when we were talking about Nikki Hiltz and how like they came out, and then we watched their career in Laysia's final season, he got his first triple-double, and I was like, you know, post-top surgery, had the pit hair going. I was like, you know, just like fully being himself on the court. And so I think I have a soft spot for them, because I'm someone who I really appreciate a great athletic performance. And yes, let me see you break some records, but who they are off the court or off the field like really matters to me too. So that's my on the spot answer. I'm sure like later I'll be like, oh my God, you know who I forgot to mention? But
Layshia's a great one to have, and sad to see them retire last year and not have, especially their voice within the WNBA. Besides what they did for the WNBA, huge.
How can people support you, and where can they follow you?
The best way to support me is to subscribe to my Substack. It's called Out of Your League, and it is a queer women's sports Substack. You can be a paid subscriber or a free subscriber. That is the best way to follow me and my work, honestly, because social media is sort of a hellscape right now. But you can also find me on Instagram, and I am the Frankie DLC on kind of everything, including my Substack. So those are the best ways. You can also buy my book, which is always appreciated. Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League. It is about the first professional women's football league in U.S. history, which a lot of people don't know happened in the 1970s. It's like a league of their own, but football in the 70s and openly gay and racially integrated.
Very cool. We love it.
That's my elevator pitch.
Yeah, I'm in. Thank you so much, Frankie, for joining us. I have enjoyed following you so much on your Substack, on your Instagram. I'm going to mention it here. You have such great design style as well. So you should follow Frankie for their writing. But also on top of that, if you love design, you should follow them as well because it's so cool. We appreciate you joining us. We appreciate all your insights. Thank you so much. And that wraps up our interview for today on Women's Sports Weekly.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our interview with Frankie de la Cretaz this week. That's it for this week. We will see you next week on Women's Sports Weekly. In the meantime, watch women's sports, rate and subscribe to the pod on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. Share the podcast with your friends. Keep sending us topics you want us to cover on Instagram at Women's Sports Weekly Pod. Thanks for joining us.